Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. This comes from John 17. Today's reading is part of the prayer or a conversation which Jesus has with God before the ascension. He must have prayed, spoken aloud and with his disciples there with him, in order to help them understand what he had come to earth to do. In the part of the prayer we hear in John 17, Jesus speaks of firstly how we can know God better, secondly how we can develop a relationship with God, and then lastly how we can make the world the place that God intended that it should be. So how do we get to know God better? In Jesus' time, to know a person's name meant that you were close to them. You knew that person. Jesus in his prayer tells God, I have made your name known to those whom you gave me. He's saying that he has made it possible for people to know God through him. The question then arises, what does it mean to know God? To know God is not about being clever or knowing facts, but rather it is about wisdom. There is a story about a young and clever Roman Catholic priest, fresh from training, who decides that for his first sermon he will preach on the theology of marriage. At the end of the service, a woman says to the parish priest, Father, I wish that I knew as little about marriage as that young priest. The young priest was clever, the woman was wise. Cleverness may get you a job or letters after your name. Cleverness is certainly much better than ignorance, but it is no substitute for wisdom. Jesus is saying in his prayer that true wisdom means knowing God. As Christians, we get closer to God through Jesus. And knowing God means one thing above all others, a pearl of wisdom beyond all price. This being knowing and feeling and discovering that we are loved by God no matter what, that God's love is unconditional. How then do we develop a relationship with God? The surest way of getting to know a person is to live with them. John begins his gospel by saying, the Word became flesh and lived among us. As you read John's gospel, you find that much of it is spent on discovering what it means to live with Jesus, or as John puts it, to abide with Jesus. Jesus prays that his disciples may be one as he and the Father are one. So what does he mean? Gerard Hughes was a Jesuit priest and a spiritual writer, a man I once had the great privilege to hear speak. Hughes used to ask just how you would respond if Jesus were to knock on your front door and ask you to stay or abide with you for a while. Hughes suggested that you would be pleased that you'd been chosen and that you would invite Jesus in and also your friends to come round and meet him. But after a while things would become difficult and embarrassing. You would have to make space for Jesus, change some of your habits to accommodate him, and then Jesus may, well, in fact he would, begin to invite what we might call undesirables into the house. The neighbours' curtains may well begin twitching. Gerard Hughes then said that we would do what so many have done through time. We would quickly lock Jesus away in a tabernacle or in the broom cupboard and bow whenever we passed it, and then get on with our lives exactly as we had before he arrived. But it need not be like that. To have a relationship with God is to make space for him, space for one another, and space for the stranger. This is what I believe the church is about. Hopefully the church is a place for all people in their needs and in their joys, a place that can still change lives and the world. And this brings us to the most important point that Jesus makes in this prayer, which concerns the world. In today's reading, that reading from John 17, Jesus prays, "I'm not asking on behalf of the world, but on those whom you gave me." Does this mean that Jesus doesn't care for the world? Well, in reality, it means exactly the opposite. Jesus has said earlier, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God gave his Son not just to the church or even to all humanity, but he gave his Son to the whole of creation. And Jesus ends his prayer by asking that we may live in him and he in us, and in so doing, that the world may believe that you have sent me. So Jesus came to live and to die for the whole of creation. The part we play in this is to take his love and to make it real in creation. An old American Indian chief was telling his grandchildren a story. In every human heart, he said, there live two wolves, and these two wolves live in our hearts until the day we die. And all the time, all of that time, they are constantly fighting each other. "What are these wolves like?" asked one of the children. "Why do they fight each other?" asked another child. The old chief looked at the children and replied, "One of the wolves is about all those things we value in ourselves and each other. Things like generosity, compassion, tolerance, and love." "What about the other wolf?" asked his granddaughter. "The other wolf is about those things we wish that we were not. Things like resentment, envy, bitterness, cruelty, and unkindness," answered the chief. "So, grandfather," asked his grandson, "which wolf wins the fight?" The chief was silent for a moment. He thought, and then he replied, "The one that always wins the fight is the one that you feed." Jesus' prayer tells us how to strengthen our world through the wisdom of building relationships with God and knowing what God wants for his world. We, and we alone, have the ability to change and save our world. How? Through the building up of good relationships and strong communities, centered and based on love. When this happens, we are one with God, just as the Father and the Son are one.